"Don't hurt me, I'll do anything," she begged. But the mountain man just treated her wounds. That's what folks remember, but they never saw what really happened deep in the pines. She came through the snow, bruised and breathless, expecting fists. But the man in that cabin didn't speak, just lit the fire. Out where the law don't always mean justice, and silence carries more weight than a gunshot, something unexpected took root. Now the snow's melting, the past is riding hard, and a choice is coming fast. When fear meets mercy, what happens next? Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The bitter wind howled through the Wind River foothills, whipping snow between the towering pines. Melissa Ward's bare feet burned with each stumbling step through the frozen underbrush. Blood trickled from cuts on her arms and face, leaving crimson drops on pristine snow. Her thin dress offered little protection against the biting cold of dawn. Her right ankle throbbed mercilessly, twisted during her desperate flight through the darkness. Each step sent shooting pain up her leg, but she forced herself onward. The sight of smoke rising from a cabin chimney had drawn her forward like a beacon of hope, or perhaps just another danger. At this point, she had no choice. The world spun around her as exhaustion and cold took their toll. Melissa's legs finally gave out, sending her crumpling into the snow. As consciousness began to fade, she heard the crunch of boots approaching through the fresh powder. Through blurred vision, she made out a tall figure emerging from the cabin. The man's broad shoulders were wrapped in a wool coat, a rifle slung across his back. His weathered face bore the heritage of both white and native blood, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. "Please," Melissa sobbed, her voice barely a whisper, "don't hurt me. I'll do anything." She tried to curl into herself, waiting for the blow that always followed begging. But the expected violence never came. The stranger, Elijah Corwin, said nothing at all. He simply knelt beside her, movements slow and careful, like approaching a wounded deer. With gentle hands that belied his size, he gathered her shivering form into his arms. Melissa tensed at first, but the warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his steps as he carried her toward the cabin began to calm her racing heart. He ducked through the low doorway, the cabin's interior glowing with welcoming firelight. He settled her on a wooden chair near the hearth, where flames crackled and danced. Still without speaking, he moved with quiet efficiency around the small space. He retrieved clean cloths and set a pot of water to boil, then carefully began tending to her wounds. The hot water stung as he cleaned the cuts on her arms and face, but his touch remained gentle. He wrapped the injuries in strips of boiled cloth with the skill of someone well-practiced at frontier medicine. When he reached for her feet, Melissa flinched instinctively. Elijah paused, his hands hovering above her swollen ankle. His eyes met hers for a moment, not demanding, simply waiting. Slowly, Melissa nodded. He removed what remained of her cracked boots with careful movements, revealing feet raw and bleeding from her flight through the woods. A pot of rich-smelling broth soon simmered on the hearth. The aroma filled the cabin, making Melissa's empty stomach clench. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. As night fell outside, Elijah arranged furs and blankets on a makeshift cot near the fire. He gestured for her to lie down, then retreated to a chair across the room. Melissa sank into the warm softness, pulling a thick fur over herself. Despite her fear and uncertainty, exhaustion quickly pulled her toward sleep. She startled awake several times during the night, heart pounding from half-remembered nightmares. Each time she found Elijah still in his chair, sleeping upright with his arms crossed. He hadn't moved closer, hadn't tried to touch her. The fire's glow revealed his face in repose, stern features softened by sleep, but still maintaining a kind of watchful presence. Melissa lay awake for a long while, studying this strange man who had offered help without demands, shelter without threat. In all her years of abuse and survival, kindness had become foreign to her, something that always came with a price. But here in this quiet cabin, with snow falling softly outside and a stranger keeping respectful distance, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: safety. The night passed slowly, marked by the settling of logs in the fireplace and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. Each time Melissa opened her eyes, she found the scene unchanged. The steady presence of her silent protector, the warmth of the fire, and the blessed absence of fear. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she allowed herself to truly rest. Morning light filtered through the cabin's small window, casting a warm glow across Melissa's face. She stirred slowly, her body aching from yesterday's ordeal. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed fresh bandages on her shoulder, the cloth clean and carefully wrapped. A tin cup of clear water sat within reach on a rough-hewn table beside her cot. The steady rhythm of an axe-splitting wood echoed from outside. Melissa pushed herself up carefully, testing her injured ankle. It still throbbed, but the swelling had gone down somewhat. Using the cabin's log walls for support, she hobbled toward the door, each step sending small jolts of pain through her leg. The door creaked as she pushed it open. Cold mountain air rushed in, carrying the crisp scent of pine and fresh-cut wood. Elijah stood in the yard, his broad shoulders working steadily as he split logs for the fire. Sweat gleamed on his forearms. Despite the morning chill, his sleeves rolled up to reveal intricate tattoos that spoke of his Shoshone heritage. He paused mid-swing when he noticed her, offering a simple nod of acknowledgement. No questions came, no demands for explanation. He simply returned to his work, giving her space to observe her surroundings at her own pace. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines that swayed gently in the wind. A modest vegetable garden lay dormant under the winter snow, and a lean-to shelter housed a few chickens that scratched in the dirt. Everything spoke of solitude, of a life lived deliberately apart from others. Throughout the day, Melissa remained inside, gathering her strength. Elijah brought her warm bread that filled the cabin with its homey aroma. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, watching through the window as he went about his daily tasks. The cabin's interior revealed little about its owner: a few books on a shelf, some carved wooden figures, and practical tools of frontier life. As evening approached, Elijah built up the fire and prepared a simple supper of beans and salt pork. They ate in comfortable silence, the crackling flames the only sound between them. The quiet felt different from the tense, threatening silences Melissa had known before. This was peaceful, undemanding. Finally, as shadows lengthened across the cabin floor, Melissa found her voice. "Why did you help me?" she asked softly, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her tin cup. Elijah looked up from where he sat, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "You looked like you needed a place to rest," he said simply. "That's all." His voice was deep but gentle, with no hint of judgment or expectation. Something about his straightforward answer, the lack of prying or demands, gave Melissa the courage to continue. She stared into the flames as words began to spill out, quiet but steady. "My husband." She swallowed hard. "He likes to gamble. When he loses, Her hand unconsciously touched her bruised shoulder. "When he drinks, it's worse." "I couldn't." Her voice caught. "I couldn't stay anymore. I just ran. I don't have anywhere else to go." The fire popped and sparked in the silence that followed her confession. Melissa held her breath, waiting for the reaction she'd come to expect from others: judgment, dismissal, or worse, the suggestion that she deserved what had happened to her. But Elijah didn't flinch or look away. He simply added another log to the fire, his movements measured and calm. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of certainty. "Then stay till you can stand." 5 simple words, but they wrapped around Melissa like a warm blanket. No conditions, no accusations, no pressure for more explanation. Just an offer of sanctuary, given as naturally as sharing bread or tending wounds. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in years, They weren't tears of fear or pain. In this quiet cabin, with this quiet man who asked nothing of her but offered everything she needed, Melissa felt the first stirrings of hope. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now she had found a safe harbor in the storm. The fire continued to burn steadily, casting its warm light over them both as they sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as the night deepened around the cabin. 3 days had passed since Melissa's arrival at the cabin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden porch as Elijah helped her outside for some fresh air. Her ankle, though healing, still made each step a careful negotiation. His strong arm steadied her as they crossed the threshold. "Easy now," he murmured, matching his pace to her halting steps. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both freeze. Through the trees, 3 riders emerged into the clearing. Melissa's fingers dug into Elijah's arm as she recognized the glint of a deputy's badge on the lead rider's chest. Deputy Gil Drayton sat tall in his saddle, his face hard as granite beneath his wide-brimmed hat. 2 townsmen flanked him, their expressions equally stern. The horses' breath steamed in the cold air as they drew to a halt before the cabin. Drayton swung down from his mount, boots crunching in the snow. His hand rested casually near his holstered pistol. "Well, well, if it ain't the runaway wife." His eyes narrowed at Melissa. "Got reports of theft and desertion, ma'am. Your husband's mighty concerned about his missing property." Before Melissa could speak, Elijah stepped forward, positioning himself between her and the deputy. His voice was quiet, but firm. "She's here of her own free will." "That so?" Drayton's lip curled. "Step aside, half-breed. Need to search that cabin of yours. Make sure nothing's been misplaced." "No." Elijah didn't raise his voice, but the word carried the weight of stone. The deputy's face flushed red. "You refusing a lawful search?" "This is treaty land." Elijah's stance remained relaxed, but his eyes never left Drayton's face. "You have no authority here." "Treaty land?" Drayton spat into the snow. "That paper don't mean nothing when you're harboring a thief." Melissa trembled behind Elijah, but found her voice. "I took nothing but what was mine by right." "Your husband says different." Drayton took a step forward, but Elijah didn't budge. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. The 2 townsmen shifted uneasily in their saddles, glancing between their deputy and the impassive frontiersman. Finally, Drayton's hand dropped from his gun belt. "This ain't over," he growled. "You'll answer for harboring her, Corwin. Both of you will." He turned and mounted up, wheeling his horse around. "Count on it." They watched the riders disappear into the trees. Only when the hoofbeats faded did Melissa's legs give way. Elijah caught her before she could fall, helping her to sit on the porch steps. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I've brought trouble to your door. I should go." "No." Elijah sat beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "You're safer here." As evening settled over the cabin, they sat before the fire. Melissa hugged her knees, still shaken from the morning's confrontation. "How can you be so sure about standing up to them?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke, his voice carried old pain. "I served as a cavalry scout years back. Saw things that haunted me. Families torn apart, treaties broken." His hands worked slowly, whittling a piece of wood. "Watched good people suffer because men with badges decided the law meant whatever suited them." He set down his knife, meeting Melissa's gaze. "I left after they detained my mother's people. Never even read her last letter." The firelight caught the moisture in his eyes. "Learned too late that power without justice ain't law at all." Melissa reached out hesitantly, touching his arm. "I'm sorry about your mother." He nodded, covering her hand with his own for a brief moment. Way I see it, sometimes standing up to false authority is the only right choice. They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned low, each finding comfort in the other's quiet strength. Outside, an owl called into the darkness, its cry echoing through the surrounding pines. Dawn painted the cabin's weathered walls in soft, golden light. Melissa stood at the window, watching Elijah split logs in the crisp morning air. Her ankle, though still tender, had improved enough for her to walk without constant pain. The cabin's wooden floors creaked beneath her careful steps as she made her way to the door. "I want to help," she said, stepping onto the porch. "Please, I can't just sit idle while you do everything." Elijah paused, axe resting against the chopping block. His dark eyes studied her for a long moment before he nodded toward a pile of fallen branches. "Kindling needs gathering. Don't strain yourself." Melissa worked slowly but steadily, collecting the smaller branches and stacking them near the cabin's wall. The simple task felt good, purposeful. When her arms were full, she carried the kindling inside, arranging it neatly beside the hearth. A worn broom stood in the corner, and Melissa took it up without hesitation. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams as she swept, working her way around the sparse furniture of the one-room cabin. Elijah watched from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do that," he said quietly. "I know." Melissa continued sweeping, her movements gentle but determined. "But I want to. It helps. Makes me feel useful again." As she worked her way around the room, something caught her eye on the rough-hewn mantel. Among the few personal items, a brass compass, a carved wooden pipe, sat a small stone carving. It depicted a woman, her features worn smooth by years of handling. The craftsmanship was beautiful, capturing a sense of dignity and grace in the simple lines. Melissa's hand hovered near the carving, not quite touching. "She's lovely." Elijah moved closer, his steps heavy. "My mother." His voice carried the weight of old grief. "She was Shoshone, made baskets finer than any I've seen since." He reached out, fingers tracing the stone woman's face. "Soldiers came to our camp when I was young, said they were moving us to safer ground." His jaw tightened. "They separated the women and children, took her away, never saw her again." "Did you?" Melissa hesitated, seeing the pain in his eyes. "Did you ever learn what happened?" "There was a letter." Elijah's words came slowly, as if each one hurt. "Came years later. Never opened it. Couldn't bear to." He turned away from the mantel, his shoulders tense. Stopped praying after that. Figured God wasn't listening anyway. Melissa's heart ached for the boy he must have been, waiting for a mother who never returned, for the man who carried that wound still. The cabin felt heavy with unspoken grief as evening settled in, shadows gathering in the corners. Later that night, as they sat before the dying fire, Melissa closed her eyes and folded her hands. Her voice was soft but clear in the quiet room. "Dear Lord," she began, "watch over our mothers, mine, who taught me your love before she passed, and his who crafted beauty from simple things." She paused, drawing a shaky breath. "Give peace to their souls, wherever they may be, and help us carry their memory with grace. Amen." When she opened her eyes, she found Elijah watching her. Firelight caught the moisture in his eyes, turning them to amber. He didn't speak, but his hand moved to touch the stone carving on the mantel, fingers gentle against the worn surface. They sat in companionable silence as the fire burned low, each lost in thoughts of mothers long gone. Outside, wind whispered through the pines, carrying the lonely call of a night bird. Inside, something fragile and warm grew between them, a shared understanding born of loss and quiet faith. Melissa added another log to the fire, its crackling filling the thoughtful silence. She understood now why he kept the carving where he could see it always, a constant reminder of love and loss. Just as she carried her own mother's memory in the way she folded her hands to pray, the gestures her mother had taught her becoming a bridge across years of separation. The flames cast dancing shadows on the cabin walls as they sat together, two souls finding comfort in shared grief and gentle understanding. Though Elijah didn't join her prayer, something in his posture had softened, as if some small knot of pain had begun to loosen in his chest. The snow began just before midnight, thick flakes swirling down from a slate-gray sky. By morning, drifts had sealed the cabin door, and white curtains obscured the windows. Melissa woke to find Elijah already stoking the fire, his breath visible in the cold air. "Might be here a spell," he said, straightening up. "Storm's settled in." Melissa wrapped her shawl tighter, watching as he checked their supplies. The pantry wasn't bare, but they'd need to be careful. Elijah seemed to read her thoughts. "Best I show you some things," he said, pulling out a length of wire from a wooden box. "Never know when skills might come in handy." Throughout that first day, Elijah taught her how to fashion snares from wire, his large hands gentle as they guided hers through the proper knots. "Loop needs to be just so," he explained, demonstrating the motion. "Too tight, animal sees it. Too loose, slips right through." Melissa's fingers fumbled at first, but she kept trying until she could make a proper snare. The pride in her accomplishment warmed her more than the fire. As snow continued falling, Elijah showed her how to strip pine branches, explaining how the thin, dry needles underneath made perfect fire starter. "Nature provides," he said quietly, "if you know where to look." The rich scent of pine filled the cabin as they worked, reminding Melissa of Christmas services long ago. When they discovered a crack in the water bucket, Elijah taught her the trick of heating pine sap until it became sticky enough to seal the wood. "Learned that from my mother," he said, then fell silent, lost in memory. The second day dawned, white and silent. They sat near the fire, the hours stretching long before them. Melissa found herself speaking of things she'd kept buried. "I used to help with Sunday school in Laramie," she said, watching the flames dance. "Loved teaching the little ones their letters." She smiled softly. "Had dreams of becoming a real teacher someday? Had even saved some money for school?" "What happened?" Elijah asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Got married instead. Thomas." She hesitated, touching her healing shoulder. "He found my savings. Lost it all at cards. Said teaching was above my station anyway." She blinked back tears. "Funny how dreams can slip away so quiet-like." Elijah was silent for a long moment. Then, surprising her, he began to speak of his own past. "After Mother disappeared, I wrote letters. Hundreds of them." His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Sent them to every fort between here and Fort Bridger, asking if anyone had seen her, knew where they'd taken the women." He stared into the fire. "Kept writing even after I left the cavalry. Couldn't stop." The third morning broke warmer, the snow beginning to melt from the cabin's eaves. While Elijah checked the roof for damage, Melissa climbed to the sleeping loft to air out the blankets. In the dim light, her foot struck something solid, a leather saddlebag, worn and dusty, shoved far under the eaves. She might have left it alone, but a letter had spilled out, yellowed with age. Her heart stopped when she saw the military seal. More letters filled the bag, dozens of them, all bearing official marks. Every single one was unopened. "Found those, did you?" Melissa startled at Elijah's voice behind her. He stood on the ladder, his expression unreadable in the shadows. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to pry." Elijah climbed the rest of the way up, settling heavily beside the saddlebag. His fingers traced the edges of the nearest envelope. "Couldn't bear to read them," he said roughly. "What if they told me she was—" He couldn't finish. "So you keep carrying the weight of not knowing," Melissa said softly, understanding filling her heart. Here was the measure of his pain, not just the loss of his mother, but the fear that had kept him from learning her fate, each unopened letter, was a testament to his love and his terror, his hope and his grief. Elijah nodded, his shoulders bowed under the weight of decades of uncertainty. The melting snow dripped steadily from the eaves outside, marking time in the heavy silence. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's frost-edged windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Melissa sat at the rough-hewn table, her fingers trembling, as she held the most recent envelope from the saddlebag. The military seal crackled as she carefully broke it, conscious of Elijah's presence by the hearth, his back turned to her but his shoulders tense with anticipation. The paper was yellowed, its creases deep from years of storage. Melissa smoothed it gently, her heart pounding as she began to read aloud. "Dear Mr. Corwin," her voice was soft but clear in the quiet cabin, "I write to you as chaplain of Fort Washakie regarding your mother, Sarah Two Rivers." Elijah's breath caught audibly. His hands gripped the mantle, knuckles white against the weathered wood. "Your mother was brought to our infirmary in the winter of 1873, suffering from fever and chest ailments." Melissa paused, watching Elijah's back stiffen. "Despite the best efforts of our medical staff, she passed peacefully on December 12th. A low sound escaped Elijah, somewhere between a groan and a whisper. Melissa continued reading, her own voice thick with emotion. "I spent time with your mother in her final days. She spoke often of you, her beloved son. Her last thoughts and prayers were for your well-being." Melissa blinked back tears as she read on. "She wanted you to know that she never blamed you for what happened, that her love for you remained constant until the end." The letter rustled as Melissa turned to the second page. Among her few possessions was a prayer book she cherished. She asked that it be sent to you, along with her eternal blessing. Elijah's shoulders began to shake. He sank slowly to his knees before the hearth, one hand still gripping the mantle, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "The prayer book accompanies this letter. May it bring you the peace your mother wished for you." Melissa's voice softened as she read the closing lines. "With deepest sympathies, Chaplain Thomas Richardson, Fort Washakie." The cabin fell silent except for the crack and pop of the fire. Melissa set the letter down and reached into the envelope, drawing out a small, leather-bound book. Its corners were worn smooth from years of handling, the pages edged in gold that had long since faded. She rose carefully from the table and approached Elijah. He remained kneeling, his face hidden, but his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Melissa knelt beside him, the prayer book cradled in her hands. "She never gave up on you," Melissa whispered, gently placing the book in his trembling hands. "She carried you in her heart until the very end." Elijah's fingers closed around the prayer book. Tears fell freely down his weathered face as he traced the worn leather cover. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with grief and relief. "All these years," he choked out, I was afraid to know." His hands tightened on the book. "Afraid she'd died alone. Afraid she'd cursed my name for not finding her in time." Melissa placed her hand lightly on his shoulder, feeling the tremors that ran through his body. "She knew you loved her. She never doubted that." Elijah opened the prayer book with careful fingers. A pressed flower fell from between its pages, a faded Indian paintbrush, its red petals preserved by time and pressure. He picked it up as if it were made of glass. "She used to gather these," he whispered, said they were messages from the Creator, little flames of hope in dark times. His voice broke. "She kept her faith right to the end, while He bowed his head, shoulders heaving with fresh grief. Melissa remained beside him, her presence steady and gentle as the morning light that filled the cabin. She watched as Elijah's tears fell on the prayer book's pages, decades of uncertainty and guilt finally finding release. Time seemed to stand still in that moment. The fire crackling softly, the sun climbing higher outside, and two souls sharing the weight of long-carried sorrow. But there was something else in the air now. Something that felt like the first breath of spring after a long winter, the beginning of healing. The days lengthened as winter's grip loosened on the Wind River foothills. Patches of dark earth emerged from melting snow, and the air carried the sweet promise of growing things. Melissa stood at the cabin's edge one morning, studying the ground where sunlight warmed the soil. "This spot," she said, pointing to a clear area near the water barrel. "The morning sun would be just right for a garden." Elijah looked up from mending a bridle. His eyes traced the path of light she indicated, and he nodded slowly. "Soil's good there. Deep enough for roots." Together they worked the earth, Elijah's strong arms breaking the winter-hardened ground with a spade, while Melissa cleared stones and dried grass. She showed him how to build up the sides with flat rocks to keep the soil from washing away in spring rains. "My grandmother taught me," she explained, fitting stones together like puzzle pieces. "She said a good garden bed is like a cradle. It needs strong sides to hold precious things." Elijah watched her hands work, noting how they no longer trembled as often. "Your grandmother was wise," he said quietly. As they worked, new rhythms emerged in their shared days. Melissa found herself humming as she swept the cabin floor or hung washing in the strengthening sun. Elijah's footsteps seemed lighter, less haunted, as he moved through his daily tasks. One afternoon, she discovered him at the workbench, carefully shaping a piece of fragrant juniper wood. His large hands moved with surprising delicacy as he carved, creating smooth curves and delicate teeth. "What are you making?" she asked, pausing in the doorway. He didn't look up, but his ears reddened slightly. "Noticed your old comb was broken," he said, testing the teeth with his thumb. Melissa's heart warmed at his thoughtfulness. That evening, when he presented her with the finished comb, its surface polished smooth as silk, she ran her fingers over the careful craftsmanship. The wood caught the firelight, rich and golden. "It's beautiful," she whispered, fighting tears. Later that week, while Elijah was out checking his trap lines, Melissa found his old coat hanging by the door. The right elbow was worn through, and several seams gaped. Taking up needle and thread, she worked quietly, matching the fabric's weathered color as best she could. When Elijah returned at dusk, he found his coat mended, the patches neat and strong. He ran his fingers over the stitching, something shifting in his expression. "Thank you," he said simply, but his eyes held more than words could say. The evening that changed everything started with burnt beans. Melissa had been lost in thought, watching spring birds return to the pines. When the smell of scorching filled the cabin, she rushed to the hearth, but it was too late. The bottom of the pot was black as coal. "I'm so sorry," she began automatically, old fears rising. But then she caught sight of Elijah's face. His eyes crinkled at the corners, and suddenly he was laughing, a rich, warm sound she'd never heard before. "Reckon we won't starve," he said, still chuckling. "Got some dried venison we can soften up?" His laughter was contagious. Melissa found herself giggling, tension melting away like spring snow. They sat together by the fire, making do with their improvised supper, sharing smiles over the ruined pot. As the evening settled around them, Elijah grew quiet, thoughtful. Then, in a voice soft as falling dusk, he began to sing. The words were Shoshone, flowing like water over stones, gentle as a mother's touch. Though Melissa couldn't understand the meaning, the melody wrapped around her heart like a warm blanket. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling silently down her cheeks. These weren't tears of fear or pain, but of something else. Something that felt like coming home after a long, hard journey. Without thinking, she leaned against his shoulder. He didn't stiffen or pull away. Instead, his voice continued, steady and sure, creating a shelter of sound in the firelit cabin. When the last note faded, Melissa whispered into the quiet, "I don't want to be afraid anymore." Elijah's hand found hers, rough palm against smooth, steady, and warm. "You don't have to be," he said softly. Not here. The fire crackled gently, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, a spring wind whispered through the pines, but inside the cabin, something new and fragile and beautiful was taking root, like the first tender shoots in their garden bed, reaching toward the light. The spring evening settled softly around the cabin as Melissa hung the last of the washing on the line. Golden light filtered through the pines, casting long shadows across the newly tilled garden bed. She hummed quietly, feeling the peace of the moment, until a flicker of movement caught her eye. A lantern swayed between the trees, its unsteady light betraying the stumbling gait of its bearer. Melissa's heart stuttered as Deputy Gil Drayton emerged from the shadows. Even at this distance, she could smell the whiskey on him. "Well now," he slurred, swaying slightly, "ain't you made yourself right at home?" Melissa backed toward the cabin door, her fingers finding the rough-hewn wood of the frame. She gripped it tight, willing her voice to stay steady. "You need to leave, Deputy Drayton. This is private property." He lurched forward, his badge catching the dying sunlight. "Private property?" He spat the words. "This here's just borrowed land. That half-breed's made you forget your place, girl." Before Melissa could slam the door, Drayton crossed the space between them with surprising speed. His fingers dug into her arm as he yanked her forward. The lantern clattered to the ground, its light spinning crazily across the packed earth. "You've been hiding here?" he growled, his face inches from hers, making that Corwin soft, acting like you're better than decent folk. His breath was hot and sour against her cheek. Something rose in Melissa then. Not fear, but fury. She remembered Elijah's quiet strength, his gentle hands, his respect for the land and its people. This man, with his whiskey breath and cruel fingers, had no right to speak of decent folk. She planted both hands against Drayton's chest and shoved with all her might. "Get off this land." The deputy stumbled backward, his face twisting with rage. The pistol appeared in his hand so fast Melissa barely saw him draw. The shot cracked through the evening air like thunder. White-hot pain blazed across her upper arm. Melissa gasped, clutching the wound as warm blood seeped between her fingers. The world tilted sideways for a moment, then righted itself as another sound cut through the gunsmoke, a bellow of rage that seemed to shake the very mountains. Elijah burst from the tree line like an avenging spirit, his rifle raised and steady. His eyes blazed with a fire Melissa had never seen before, but his hands were rock steady on the weapon. Drayton swung his pistol toward the new threat, but his drunk, clumsy fingers fumbled. The deputy's eyes widened as he found himself staring down the barrel of Elijah's rifle. But Elijah didn't pull the trigger. Instead, his voice rolled across the yard like summer thunder. "You're on my land, Drayton." Each word fell like a stone. "And the treaty says I have the right to defend it." The deputy's face worked through several emotions: rage, fear, and finally something like uncertainty. His eyes darted between Elijah's unwavering rifle and the blood on Melissa's arm. "Treaty ain't worth the paper it's written on," Drayton spat. But there was a tremor in his voice now. "Test me," Elijah said softly, dangerously, "and we'll see what's worth what." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Drayton's nerve broke. He stumbled backward, nearly falling as he made his way to where his horse stood waiting. The deputy hauled himself into the saddle, swaying dangerously. "This ain't over," he called back, trying to salvage some dignity. "Either of you show your faces in town, there'll be consequences." Then he was gone, crashing through the underbrush with none of the grace he'd shown arriving. Elijah waited until the sounds of Drayton's retreat faded before lowering his rifle. In 2 long strides, he reached Melissa, gathering her carefully into his arms. His hands trembled now as they examined her wound. "I should have stopped him," he muttered, voice thick with self-reproach. "Should have been here. Should have known he'd come back." Melissa leaned into his solid warmth, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. "You did stop him," she whispered. "You chose mercy when you could have chosen vengeance. That makes you the better man." Elijah's arms tightened around her, and she felt him draw a shuddering breath. The lantern Drayton had dropped still flickered on the ground, casting their joined shadows against the cabin wall. Two people holding each other up, neither willing to let the other fall. The lantern's glow cast long shadows as Elijah guided Melissa back into the cabin. His hands shook as he helped her sit at the rough-hewn table, the familiar space now feeling different after violence had touched their sanctuary. The wound on her arm still bled, staining her sleeve crimson. "Hold still," he murmured, gathering clean cloths and the tin of healing salve he kept for emergencies. His fingers trembled as he rolled up her sleeve, revealing the angry graze where Drayton's bullet had torn across her flesh. Melissa drew in a sharp breath as he began cleaning the wound with water he'd boiled earlier that day. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his touch becoming even gentler. "You didn't fail me," she whispered back, her free hand finding his wrist. "You saved me again." Her eyes held his, steady and sure despite the pain. "Just like that first morning when I stumbled here." Elijah worked in silence, carefully applying the salve and wrapping clean bandages around her arm. Each wince that crossed her face felt like an accusation to him, though she never complained. When he finished, he remained seated beside her, his large hands resting uselessly on the table. "I wanted to kill him," he admitted, his voice rough. "When I heard that shot, saw you bleeding." He trailed off, the memory making his jaw clench. "I had the shot. Could have ended it right there." The cabin fell quiet except for the soft pop of the hearth fire. Melissa rose slowly, moving to the mantel where his mother's prayer book lay. She picked it up with reverence, its worn leather familiar now to both of them. "But you didn't," she said, returning to sit beside him. She placed the prayer book in his lap, her movements deliberate and gentle. "You chose better." Elijah stared down at the book, his mother's last possession. His fingers traced the faded cover where countless prayers had been whispered over its pages. "I'm afraid," he confessed, the words barely audible. "Afraid of what happens if I fight back. Afraid of becoming the kind of man who answers violence with violence." He looked up at Melissa, his eyes troubled. "The kind of man who uses force just because he can." "Look at what you did instead," Melissa said, her good hand covering his where it rested on the prayer book. "You protected me. You protected your land. But you did it with words and law, not bullets." She squeezed his fingers. "You became the man she prayed for." Elijah's breath caught in his throat as he remembered the chaplain's letter Melissa had read to him. His mother had died praying for him, hoping he would find his way to peace in a world that offered little of it. "The treaty," he said slowly. "It wasn't just paper to her. It was a promise that we could live differently. Better." He opened the prayer book, its pages soft with age. "When I left the cavalry, I thought I was running from everything. But maybe—" He paused, finding the words. "Maybe I was running toward what she always wanted for me." Melissa nodded, her eyes bright with understanding. Strength isn't always in fighting back. Sometimes it's in standing firm and choosing mercy when others expect violence. She touched his cheek gently. "That's what you did today. That's what makes you different from men like Drayton." The truth of her words settled over him like a warm blanket. His mother had known this, had tried to teach him before they were separated. And now here was Melissa, helping him understand it at last. Restraint wasn't weakness. It was strength of the highest order. "Thank you," he whispered, though the words seemed inadequate for all she had helped him see. "For helping me remember who I am." Melissa's smile was soft in the firelight. "We help each other remember," she said simply, and in her voice was all the truth of their time together. The wagon wheels creaked against the rutted road as Elijah and Melissa made their way into Dry Creek. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street, and a cool spring breeze carried the scent of fresh-baked bread from the boarding house. Melissa sat straight-backed beside Elijah, her borrowed skillet wrapped carefully in burlap on her lap. "You don't have to do this," Elijah said quietly, his hands steady on the reins. Melissa touched the bandage on her arm, now healing beneath her sleeve. "Yes, I do," she replied. "Some debts need paying, even if they weren't mine to make." They pulled up in front of Eaton's Mercantile, the wooden sidewalk already busy with morning shoppers. Heads turned as Elijah stepped down from the wagon, then offered his hand to help Melissa. She accepted it with grace, holding her chin high despite the stares. The bell above the mercantile door chimed as Melissa entered. Mrs. Eaton looked up from her ledger, her spectacles catching the light from the window. The store smelled of coffee beans and leather, with rows of tin goods gleaming on the high shelves. "Mrs. Eaton," Melissa said clearly, unwrapping the skillet, "my husband took this without proper payment. I've come to make it right." She placed 3 silver dollars beside the cookware, the coins bright against the worn counter. Mrs. Eaton studied the skillet, then Melissa, her weathered face unreadable. After a long moment, she reached beneath the counter and brought out a wrapped bundle that released the warm scent of apple and cinnamon. "Fresh baked this morning," Mrs. Eaton said, placing the pie in Melissa's startled arms. Her voice softened. "Sometimes making things right means accepting kindness too." Outside, townsfolk gathered in small clusters, watching as Elijah helped Melissa back into the wagon. The pie sat warm in her lap, replacing the weight of the skillet. Whispers passed between the onlookers like wind through prairie grass. "Heard she left that no-good husband of hers," one woman murmured. "That Corwin's been keeping her safe up in his cabin," another replied. They had just reached the livery stable when Deputy Drayton emerged from the saloon, his badge glinting dully in the morning light. His boots scraped against the wooden walkway as he approached, hand resting too casually near his holster. "Well, if it ain't the half-breed and his runaway," Drayton called out, loud enough to draw more attention. "Come to show your faces in decent company?" The street grew quiet. Elijah's shoulders tensed, but before he could respond, a gruff voice cut through the silence. "That half-breed saved my boy's life." Dale Tuckett stepped forward from the crowd, his lined face set with determination. The old rancher's voice carried the weight of years spent working the harsh Wyoming earth. 2 winters back, when Tommy got caught in that blizzard, Elijah tracked him for 6 hours in that storm, carried him home half frozen but breathing. Drayton's lip curled. "One good deed don't make..." "Fixed my fence line too," another voice called out. Jim Wheeler, who ran sheep in the valley, pushed his way forward. "During that drought last summer. Wouldn't take a penny for the work, neither." More voices joined in, each with their own story. How Elijah had helped pull a wagon from the creek bed. How he'd shared his hunting knowledge during lean times. How he'd respected the boundaries between his land and theirs, never causing trouble despite the suspicious looks and cold shoulders he'd endured. The morning sun climbed higher as the stories continued, each one painting a picture of a man who had served his neighbors quietly, asking nothing in return. Drayton's face darkened with each new voice, his authority diminishing in the face of simple truth. Melissa watched the transformation happening around them, her eyes bright with unshed tears. These weren't just stories. They were testament to the man she'd come to know, whose gentle strength had offered her shelter when she needed it most. Dale Tuckett stepped closer to the wagon, his calloused hand resting on the wooden side. "Reckon we owe you an apology, Elijah," he said, his voice rough with sincerity. "Been too quick to judge, too slow to see what kind of man you really are." Elijah sat silent for a moment, his hands still on the reins. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. No apologies needed, just trying to live right by the land and its people. The gathered crowd nodded, understanding in their faces. They were frontier folk who measured worth by actions, not words, and Elijah's deeds had spoken louder than any prejudice. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dry Creek's courthouse steps as Judge Franklin Barrett descended from the stagecoach. His black coat was dusty from the 2-day journey from Rawlins, but his bearing remained dignified. The circuit judge's arrival had drawn a crowd of onlookers, their whispers carrying on the cool morning breeze. Elijah and Melissa stood together near the courthouse entrance, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The bruise on her face had faded to yellow, but the memory of Drayton's violence remained fresh. The deputy himself stood apart from the crowd, his face tight with barely contained anger as the judge approached. Inside the courthouse, the judge settled behind the worn oak desk, his silver-streaked hair catching the light from the tall windows. Deputy Drayton was called in first. The townspeople pressed close to the windows, straining to hear as the judge's stern voice carried through the glass. Based on multiple witness accounts of misconduct and abuse of authority, Judge Barrett declared, "You are hereby removed from your position as deputy, pending a full inquiry." His weathered hands reached across the desk. "Your badge, Mr. Drayton." Drayton's face flushed dark red as he unpinned his star. The metal made a dull sound as it hit the judge's desk. Without a word, the former deputy stormed out, shouldering roughly past the gathered crowd. A few minutes later, the court clerk appeared at the door. "Mr. Corwin and Mrs. Ward," he called, "the judge would like to speak with you privately." The courthouse felt suddenly quiet as Elijah and Melissa entered, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. Judge Barrett gestured for them to sit in the chairs before his desk. His keen eyes studied them both before settling on Melissa. "Mrs. Ward," he said gently, "I'd like to hear your account of these events. Take your time." Melissa sat straight-backed in her chair, her hands folded carefully in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, though quiet. She told of her husband's gambling, the escalating abuse, the night she finally fled with nothing but the clothes on her back. She described finding shelter with Elijah and Drayton's drunken attack that left her wounded. "I never stole anything," she said firmly. "I even returned the skillet my husband took, paid in full with my own money." The judge nodded, making notes in his ledger. He turned to Elijah. "And you, Mr. Corwin? What made you decide to help Mrs. Ward?" Elijah's deep voice filled the room. "She needed help. That's all there was to it." He paused, then added, "She broke no law by leaving a man who beat her. I offered sanctuary on my own land, as is my right." "Yes, about your land." Judge Barrett reached into his briefcase and withdrew a thick document. "I've reviewed the treaty records and your claim. Everything is in order, but given recent events, I believe we need something more official." He spread out a formal land grant on his desk, the elaborate script gleaming with fresh ink. "This document reaffirms your treaty deed and clearly establishes your property rights under territorial law. No local authority can challenge it." Elijah stared at the paper, his expression carefully controlled. The judge dipped his pen in ink and signed with a flourish, then pressed his official seal into the hot wax at the bottom. "Not many men would have shown the same restraint you did, Mr. Corwin," Judge Barrett said, handing him the document. "When Drayton threatened Mrs. Ward on your land, you had every right to defend your property with force. Instead, you chose words over violence. That speaks to your character." Melissa watched as Elijah's fingers traced the edges of the land grant. She knew what this meant to him. Official recognition of his right to the land he'd tended so carefully, the home he'd built between two worlds. "Thank you, Your Honor," Elijah said quietly. The judge leaned back in his chair. "Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing," he said. "It's about protecting those who do right. This territory needs more men like you, Mr. Corwin. Men who understand that true strength lies in restraint." Through the courthouse windows, they could see the townspeople still gathered outside, waiting to hear the judge's decisions. The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the last of the morning mist. In its clear light, something new was taking root in Dry Creek, something that felt like justice. The evening settled softly around Elijah's homestead, painting the Wind River foothills in deep purple shadows. Stars began to pierce the darkening sky one by one, like pinpricks in an indigo blanket. The day's events at the courthouse had left both Elijah and Melissa quiet, each lost in their own thoughts as they sat on the porch steps. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and sage, stirring Melissa's hair as she gazed up at the emerging constellations. The wooden steps still held the day's warmth beneath them. Behind them, a lamp glowed through the cabin window, casting their shadows long across the packed earth of the yard. "I've been thinking," Melissa said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Her hands twisted gently in her lap, a habit that showed when she was gathering courage. "About what comes next, now that things are settled with the law." Elijah turned slightly toward her, his profile strong against the starlit sky. He didn't speak, but his attention was complete, patient. "Yesterday at the mercantile, I saw some children outside." Melissa's voice grew stronger as she continued. "3 of them were watching through the schoolhouse window while classes went on inside. They weren't allowed in. 1 was a mixed-blood child. 2 were from that poor family that lost their farm last winter." She paused, drawing a deep breath. "It made me remember my old dreams of teaching before everything changed. But maybe those dreams weren't meant to die. Maybe they were just waiting for the right time." The crickets sang in the darkness as Melissa went on, her words coming faster now, filled with growing passion. "This land has space enough. We could build something here, a schoolhouse for children who've been left out. Those too mixed, too poor, or too forgotten for the town's little whitewashed school." Her hands gestured as she spoke, sketching her vision in the night air. "A place where no child has to press their face against a window to learn. Where they can sit at real desks, hold real books, and know they belong." Elijah remained silent for so long that Melissa began to worry she'd said too much, but when she glanced at him, she saw his eyes were bright with emotion in the starlight. "You dream like my mother did," he said finally, his deep voice gentle with memory. "She used to gather the children in our band, teach them stories and songs when the army wasn't watching. Said every child deserved to learn, no matter what others thought of them." He turned to face her fully now, and Melissa could see the same quiet determination in his expression that he'd shown at the courthouse. "We could build it," he said, "right there, where the land levels out near the creek." Melissa's breath caught in her throat. "We?" Elijah nodded, his gaze sweeping over the property as if already seeing the schoolhouse standing there. "The creek would be good for the children in summer. There's shelter from the wind, and the morning light would be right." His voice took on a practical tone. "We'll need benches. I can make those from the oak I've been seasoning." "And a bell," Melissa added softly, hope rising in her chest like a dawn. "Every proper school needs a bell." "A bell," Elijah agreed, the corner of his mouth lifting in a slight smile. "I know a trader who comes through with church supplies. He might have one, or know where to find it." Melissa's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy this time. Here, under the vast Wyoming sky, her broken dreams were taking new shape. Not just her dreams either. She could see how this would honor Elijah's mother too, carrying forward her belief in teaching all children, no matter their background. "We could make something that matters," she whispered, "something bigger than our pain." Elijah's hand found hers in the darkness, warm and calloused. "Something new," he agreed. "Something good." They sat together in the growing night, their shared vision expanding like the stars above them. Where others had tried to break them, they would build. Where doors had been closed, they would open new ones. The wounds of their past would become the foundation for something beautiful, a place of learning, of belonging, of hope. The crickets sang their endless song and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its mate. On the porch of the cabin, Melissa and Elijah continued to plan in quiet voices, transforming their pain into purpose beneath the watching stars. Summer sweetened the Wind River air as weeks flowed past like the creek water. Morning after morning, the steady rhythm of Elijah's saw filled the homestead. Planks of fresh-cut pine and oak stacked higher against the cabin wall, their golden surfaces catching the sun. The scent of sawdust hung sweet and heavy in the warm breeze. Inside the cabin, Melissa sat at the rough-hewn table, her pen scratching across paper as she wrote to her old friend Sarah in Laramie. The letter was careful and hopeful, requesting slates and chalk for the children who had already begun appearing at the edge of the property, drawn by curiosity and whispered word of something new taking shape. "Dear Sarah," she wrote, "the children come like shy deer at first, watching from the trees. 3 yesterday, 2 Shoshone boys and a settler's daughter. Today there were 5. They don't know yet that they're the reason we're building, but they sense something is changing." The first to venture close was a small Shoshone boy with bright eyes, who watched Elijah work from behind a juniper bush. The next day he brought his sister. By week's end, 4 more children had gathered, some mixed blood like Elijah, others white but wearing clothes too worn for the town school. They sat in the grass, watching the walls rise board by board. One morning, a wagon rattled up the path. Hannah Brooks, a young widow whose husband had died in a mining accident, climbed down clutching a bundle of books to her chest. "I heard what you're doing," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I used to help at the school in Denver before. I'd like to help teach if you'll have me." Melissa's eyes filled with tears as she embraced the younger woman. "The children will need more than one teacher," she said softly, "and so will I." The news spread through town like wildfire. The next Sunday, Mrs. Eaton from the Mercantile sent over a box of pencils. The blacksmith's wife arrived with a stack of simple primers saved from her own children's school days. Even the circuit-riding preacher contributed a dozen wooden slates he'd been keeping in his saddlebags. Elijah worked from sunrise to sunset, his hands steady and sure. The schoolhouse took shape, a simple building with tall windows to catch the light, a sturdy floor raised above the spring mud, and a steep roof to shed the winter snow. Inside, he built benches with backs and a teacher's desk that made Melissa gasp when she saw it, her hands running over the smooth surface where he'd carved delicate leaves along the edge. The bell arrived on a trader's wagon, its bronze surface gleaming. Elijah mounted it in a tower he'd built special, testing the rope with careful pulls that sent clear notes ringing across the valley. On the morning before opening day, Elijah stood before the finished schoolhouse, studying its clean lines against the blue sky. In his hands, he held a sign he'd carved from a plank of white pine. The letters were deep and sure. The Willow School. Melissa came to stand beside him, her eyes questioning the name. Elijah gestured to the creek where willows bent graceful over the water. "Willows survive floods," he said quietly. "They bend but don't break, and wherever their branches touch earth, new trees grow." Tears spilled down Melissa's cheeks as she understood. This was more than a school. It was a testament to survival, to growing stronger through storms, to making something beautiful from broken ground. Opening day dawned clear and cool. Melissa stood before the mirror in their cabin, smoothing the simple blue dress she'd sewn for the occasion. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned back her hair. Outside, the first families were already arriving, mothers leading children by the hand, fathers carrying smaller ones on their shoulders, Shoshone families in their finest clothes, settler children with scrubbed faces and darned stockings, mixed-blood little ones who no longer had to hide their heritage. Hannah Brooks arranged books and slates on the desks, while parents filled the benches they'd brought to line the walls. The room hummed with whispered conversations in English and Shoshone. At exactly 8 o'clock, Elijah gripped the bell rope and pulled. The clear tone rang out across the valley, echoing off the hills. A sound of welcome, of beginning, of hope. Melissa stood before the gathered children, her heart so full she could barely speak. 23 faces looked back at her, some eager, some uncertain, all belonging. Here there would be no locked doors, no children pressing faces against windows from outside. Here everyone would learn together. "Welcome," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "to your school." The first day of school ended as the sun painted long shadows across the valley. Elijah and Melissa walked home together, their footsteps crunching on the path while crickets began their evening song. The satisfaction of the day settled around them like a warm blanket. Children's laughter still echoing in their memories, chalk dust still clinging to Melissa's skirts. Inside their cabin, Elijah moved with practiced ease, striking a match to light the oil lamp. The familiar scent of kerosene mingled with pine smoke from the hearth as the flame caught and steadied. Golden light spilled across the wooden table, catching the worn grain of boards that had witnessed so many quiet meals between them. Melissa unwrapped Mrs. Eaton's pie carefully, the paper crinkling beneath her fingers. Steam rose from the golden crust, carrying the sweet scent of apple and cinnamon through the room. She placed it reverently at the center of the table, remembering how not so long ago she'd feared even entering the mercantile. Now here was Mrs. Eaton's pie, a peace offering, a welcome, a bridge between past and future. They sat across from each other as they had so many times before, but tonight felt different. The air between them hummed with possibility, like the moment before a spring storm breaks. Their hands found each other across the table's weathered surface, fingers intertwining with familiar ease. Melissa's small, work-roughened hands nestled perfectly in Elijah's larger, calloused ones. The cabin creaked softly around them, settling into evening. Through the window, the last rays of sunlight caught dust motes dancing in the air, turning them to floating gold. The mantel still held Elijah's mother's stone carving, but now it was flanked by wildflowers Melissa had gathered, dried and hung in small bunches. Elijah's thumb traced gentle circles on her palm as he gathered his thoughts. His face, usually so guarded, softened in the lamplight. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and thoughtful, carrying the weight of everything they'd shared. "You asked not to be hurt," he said, his dark eyes holding hers. "But you never asked for anything better." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Melissa felt tears prick at her eyes as she remembered that first desperate morning, bloodied, terrified, expecting only more pain. She hadn't dared to hope for kindness, let alone for the life that had slowly grown between them like wildflowers through stone. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached across the table, but her voice was steady. "I'd like to stay," she whispered. "If you'll have me?" Elijah's face creased into one of his rare, gentle smiles. "You already did," he replied simply, his fingers tightening around hers. Outside, the wind whispered through pine needles, carrying the first warm breath of spring. It ruffled the curtains Melissa had hung, played with the prayer book's pages, where it lay open on the shelf, and carried the lingering echo of the school bell across the valley. Inside, the fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Hope flickered beside it, warm and steady as the lamplight, strong as the bond between their clasped hands. This wasn't a refuge anymore. It was home. They weren't two wounded souls seeking shelter. They were partners, choosing each other not from fear or necessity, but from love that had grown slowly, surely, like the garden they'd planted together. The pie sat untouched between them, its sweetness forgotten in the deeper sweetness of the moment. They held each other's gaze across the table that had seen so many shared meals, so many quiet conversations, so many small kindnesses, building day by day into something profound. In that gentle silence, everything that needed saying had been said. They were no longer two people fighting separate battles against loneliness and pain. They were something new, something whole. Like the school they'd built, like the community they'd gathered, like the love that had grown between them as naturally as wildflowers after rain. The lamp burned steady, and hope burned steadier still, warming them like sunshine after storm. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.